Thursday, which it feels like Thursday today, just because you guys don't have class. Oops, I turned the wrong ones off. You guys don't have class this Thursday. So even when I was writing out announcements, I was like, oh, next Tuesday. It feels like Thursday. But last Thursday, we finished talking, we finished with this slide. So I'm going to start right here. We're going through the digestive tract again, starting at the top, working our way down through the whole tract itself. And we got to the stomach, so we didn't get too far. And the stomach has 4 big cells found in the stomach. You have to know what they do. You have to. I know they're on the exam. I'm not going to tell you which one and how I asked them, but I'm like, you have to know these cells that are found in the stomach and what they do. What do they make? The first one, the mucous neck cells, it makes a thin acidic mucus, but we don't know really what it does. But the other 3, we do know what they do. We do know the secretions that they make.
So would that one not be on?
Probably not.
Okay. It gives us the 75%
There we go. The second one, though, is the parietal cell secretions. And these particular cells are found mostly in the fundus region of the stomach. If I drew out the stomach, I got a not artistic. And I'm like, the fundus would be the very top part region. And like we find lots of them there, and most of them in the body, the major part of it. The parietal cells make 2 things. One of them is hydrochloric acid. Your stomach has a very low pH. There is acid in your stomach. That shouldn't be news. Well, this particular cell is going to make that hydrochloric acid to give that really low pH in the stomach. Now, why it's good to have the low pH in the stomach, I'm like, there's a reason why we have everything. One, it helps start to break apart proteins by denaturing them. It activates an enzyme called pepsin, which also helps break down proteins. It can break down plant cell walls, so if you're eating a salad. And it kills a whole bunch of bacteria, because you don't eat sterile food. Sorry. And I'm like, you guys are eating bacteria all the time. When you drop something on the floor and you're like, 5-second rule, there is no 5-second rule. You are eating bacteria all the time, and that low pH in the stomach kills a lot of the bacteria. It does not kill them all, which is why you can eat stuff and you still get food poisoning, but it does kill a lot of the bacteria. The other thing that this cell makes is the intrinsic factor. The intrinsic factor is a chemical that allows our intestines to absorb the vitamin B12. And I'm like, now, the intrinsic factor, we need vitamin B12. I talk about it in another slide coming up too. We need vitamin B12 in our body. We need to absorb it. Vitamin B12 is required to mature red blood cells. So if you didn't have vitamin B12 in your body, even if you ate vitamin B12 all day long and you're like, I eat vitamin B12, I take the little vitamin B12, supplements. If you can't absorb it, it doesn't matter how much you take by a supplement. We need this intrinsic factor to absorb vitamin B12. And I'm like, if you don't get vitamin B12 in the body, you can't have mature red blood cells. And if you don't have mature red blood cells, what's going to happen? Sometimes. It could lead to death. The big thing, what are red blood cells for? Yeah, carrying gases, and I'm like, particularly oxygen. Some of the first symptoms is you're generally going to have some type of anemia. Like you don't have enough red blood cells to carry enough oxygen required for the body's needs. And I'm like, you're going to be tired. I'm like, we need the intrinsic factor. Now, because the intrinsic factor is made in the stomach so that later in your small intestine you can absorb vitamin B12, it is that particular chemical that makes our stomach non-replaceable. And I'm like, this is the only thing that really we absolutely need our stomach for. And I'm like, you can still live without your stomach. There are times that people have to have their stomach fully removed, whether some type of extensive damage, some type of cancer, they have to remove the stomach. And I'm like, we could live without hydrochloric acid. Your food could still get broken down in your small intestine. And I'm like, however, the intrinsic factor is needed. If you don't have your stomach, if it had to be removed, you are going to require vitamin B12 injections so that you can get that vitamin B12 into your bloodstream. It's the only reason we need our stomachs.
How would someone take B12 vitamins?
It's still good. I mean, if you don't get vitamin B12 in your diet, I mean, you need vitamin B12. And I'm like,
people that try to build muscle.
Not really. I mean, again, we need it to help mature red blood cells. And so I guess it could help maybe give you more oxygen carrying capacity. You can work out longer. Oh. Intrinsic factor. Yep. Now, another cell, because there were 4 cells. Third cell are your chief cells. They make something known as pepsinogen. It's an inactive enzyme. However, pepsinogen doesn't stay inactive very long. It gets activated, and it goes from pepsinogen to pepsin. The gen just means generate. It's like before it becomes pepsin, it's pepsinogen. And so your chief cells, my little purple ones on here, make pepsinogen. The hydrochloric acid that was made by your parietal cells will activate pepsinogen to become pepsin. Why we need pepsin? Pepsin is to break down proteins. They both start with P's. Works out. And I'm like, pepsin helps break down proteins. Now, pepsin can also activate pepsinogen to become more pepsin. It is one of those positive feedbacks that the more pepsin you have, the more pepsin you can have. And another thing that your chief cells make is they make lipases. And again, a lot of enzymes end in ACE, not all of them though. And lipases are there to break down or start digesting lipids. And I'm like, your enzymes, your lipases in your stomach digest about 15% of the lipids. Most of your lipids get digested further down in your intestinal tract, down into your small intestine. But about 15% are digested in the stomach because of the lipase enzyme. And then the 4th cell is an enteroendocrine cell. Now, I wrote up in there for a reason, because you see entero and you're going to see gastro in a lot of words. Anything entero means intestine, although we are in the stomach. And I'm like, this is an endocrine cell. The endocrine system is all hormones. Entero meaning intestine. These are cells, although they're technically in the stomach, they say they're intestinal type cells. And I'm like, these are cells found in our stomach that make hormones. They're not technically part of the endocrine system, but they make hormones like the endocrine system that do various features. And I'm like, so they act as what is known as a paracrine. A paracrine is just a hormone made outside of the endocrine system. It's still a hormone. It's just not made by the endocrine system, which makes the majority part of our hormones. Now, there are several hormones that can be made inside of our stomach. The biggest hormone is gastrin. Again, it's a hormone, and yes, the gastrin is named for a reason, because this is a hormone made in the stomach. And gastrin has lots of functions, as we'll see it come up in some of our upcoming slides. Now, in your stomach, so those are your 4 basic cells and what they make, and they all have some function in breaking down food. Your stomach has a very harsh digestive condition. Again, it has a low pH, it's got various types of digested enzymes. In theory, your stomach could digest itself. Could you eat an animal stomach and digest it? Absolutely. Same thing. Your stomach could digest itself. So we try to prevent that from happening. One of it is we have a mucosal barrier that protects against that acid. It protects against any of the enzyme. And so it has a really thick layer of bicarbonate-rich mucus. Now, bicarbonate is your HCO3, that bicarbonate ion that we talked about in the respiratory tract. And that mucus itself has a lot of that bicarbonate ion to absorb some of the hydrogen ions from your acid. There's also tight junctions between the epithelial cells to prevent anything, whether it's enzymes, whether it's acid, from seeping through the cells. And if there is any kind of damage, the epithelial cells in your stomach are replaced very, very quickly. And I'm like, on average, your epithelial cells in your stomach are completely replaced, but every 3 to 6 days. So it's like every 3 to 6 days, you have a whole new lining in your stomach. And so I'm like, if there is any damage, we replace it right away. And I'm like, we want nice, fresh cells so that we don't have any damage. Now, some things can happen, though. One of them is called gastritis, which just means inflammation of anything stomach-related, which is what the word means. And I'm like, and it's usually because something got past that mucosal layer. Something breached through those tight junctions. Something got through the mucous membranes and damaged part of your stomach. Now, if it damages it long enough, it can lead to what are known as peptic or gastric ulcers. This is where we are literally kind of eating away at the stomach lining itself. And so this is pretty severe, and I'm like eroding away at the stomach lining. Now, it can go all the way through the stomach. You could get a hole in your stomach. That acid, those enzymes could digest a hole right through your stomach. And if you have a hole in your stomach, guess what's leaking out? Acids and enzymes right into your abdominal cavity. This is when we get to something known as peritonitis, extremely painful. And I'm like, and if it's left long enough, yeah, it's deadly because you're literally digesting yourself from the inside out. Most likely before that happens, because you're going to be in so much pain, you are going to have hemorrhaging. Is that as this starts to wear at your stomach lining, you have blood vessels going through your stomach that you're going to wear away and reveal blood vessels, and you're going to have bleeding inside your stomach. Now, some of the symptoms of bleeding, well, if you lose enough blood, you're going to have anemia. A lot of times you can be very pale, very tired. If you've got blood going into your stomach, eventually that blood makes its way through the digestive tract, and you'll have blood in your fecal matter. And I'm like, it's very painful. Just some indications that you've got hemorrhaging going on. Now, top things that lead to ulcers. Most people thought stress led to ulcers. It doesn't. Some are like, oh, well, coffee and stress, and I don't even know other things that are like, oh, these all cause ulcers. They don't. The top leading thing that causes ulcers is a bacteria. The bacteria is called Helicobacter pylori. Helico, because it kind of has almost a twisty-turny helical shape. And pylori, because one of the regions of the stomach is called your pylorus. And so this is a bacteria that's found in the stomach. The thing that this bacteria does is it kind of eliminates or thins the mucus lining. And if you thin that protective mucus lining in your stomach, the acid's going to wear away and cause those ulcers to form. Now, why people thought stress caused ulcers is, well, when you're under a lot of stress, or if you are drinking coffee or eating certain types of foods, it could cause your stomach to produce additional acid. And if you have an ulcer, and now you made extra acid, it's going to irritate the existing ulcer. So those foods and drinks didn't cause the ulcer, they just irritate it. Now, it's not the only thing that causes ulcers. It's the top thing that can cause ulcers. There are some ulcers that can be caused by your non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And I'm like, your aspirin, ibuprofen. And I'm like, they say you shouldn't be taking some of these anti-inflammatory drugs for long periods of time because it can damage that mucosal lining. So even people that take a low-dose aspirin put them at high risk of developing ulcers because it's thinning that mucus lining. So I'm like, most by bacteria, some from those over-the-counter drugs. Now, in your stomach, there is digestion happening. There is breakdown of food happening. One, there is some physical digestion. That's physical breakdown of food. The fact is, when your food is in your stomach, it is getting squeezed by the stomach. That's a physical breakdown. It is getting churned around in your stomach. However, it's also getting chemically broken down. We're going to start to break down or denature some of the proteins by your hydrochloric acid. We have various types of enzymes, like your pepsin, that's going to break down proteins. Infants have an additional enzyme called renin that help break down milk protein. Now, the interesting factoid about infants and the renin that breaks down milk proteins, because that's the only thing that infants are getting for nutrients, they have this extra enzyme that breaks down the milk protein, and when that milk gets to their stomach and that renin breaks it down, it does cause milk to almost turn into like a curd-like consistency. So if you've ever seen an infant throw up, it kind of has that white, cheesy, curd-like appearance. Well, that's because they have an additional enzyme that's breaking apart the milk protein in there that makes it that curd-like appearance. We have enzymes. We have lipases, some created by the stomach, some created by the saliva that it was already made up in the saliva and made its way down into the stomach. Lipases that are starting breaking down lipids, your triglycerides. But the job of the stomach is to deliver chyme. And I'm like, it started off as a food bolus, a ball of food when it got to the stomach. But because of the further breakdown inside the stomach, we no longer call it a food bolus anymore. We call it chyme. And I'm like, that it doesn't quite resemble food as much as it did as a food bolus. So it delivers chyme to the small intestine. Now, I mentioned this before. I knew I was going to get ahead of myself. The only stomach function that's essential to life is the fact that we've got that intrinsic factor for vitamin B12 absorption. Because the vitamin B12 is needed to mature your red blood cells. If you don't have the intrinsic factor, you can't mature your red blood cells, and you suffer from a type of anemia. It's treated with vitamin B12 injections. So it does happen that people have to have their stomach removed. They just have to have permanent vitamin B12 injections. Now, there's lots of fluids. There's hydrochloric acids, and there's various enzymes. There's lots of fluids in your stomach. Some of them are controlled by your nervous system. Some of them are controlled by hormones, like how much fluid does your stomach make? Well, your gastric mucosa makes about 3 liters of stomach juices, gastric juices, a day. There's a lot of stomach juice in there, and that's not even the juices that your intestines are making. Your stomach is making about 3 liters of gastric juices a day. Now, our nerve stimulation is our vagus nerve stimulation. This is the nerve stimulation pretty much controlled by your head. It's involuntary, and your vagus nerve stimulation is going to increase the secretion. And when I say it's your head, just looking at food is going to right away just be like, oh, that looks really good, or wow, that smells really good. That smelling, that seeing, even the tasting, because it's in your mouth, and I'm like, that's all vagus nerve stimulation is going to increase your stomach juices. So just seeing food and smelling food is enough to make your gastric juices start to secrete. This is why a lot of times if you see food or smell food and all of a sudden your stomach starts to growl, that's because your stomach it's getting ready for food, even if you don't get to eat it, but it's getting ready for food. Now, your sympathetic stimulation, this is the part of the nervous system when you're under stress, is going to decrease secretion. And so anytime you are under stress, if you were, scared or doing something that your body is just active, and I'm like, it decreases your stomach juices or secretions. And I'm like, it's why when people are under stress, they're not hungry. And everyone's like, oh, but I eat when I'm stressed. Well, sometimes that's more just you don't want to be doing something when you're stressed. But in itself, your stomach is, if you're truly stressed, like life and death stressed, and I'm like, your intestine is trying to shut down. It's trying to shunt more activity elsewhere for survival. Now, your nervous system controls your gastric secretion. The main hormone that controls gastric secretion is the hormone gastrin. Now, gastrin, it's from the stomach, and I'm like, increases the amount of enzymes that are secreted and increases how much hydrochloric acid is secreted to try to break down foods. Now, most of your small intestine secretions, which I'm not sure how far we'll get in those today, and I'm like, are gastrin antagonists. By the time the food gets to your intestine, we start sending information back to the stomach. Okay, you've done your job. We've got the food now. And so your small intestine secretions usually stop or slow down your gastric secretions. So they work against each other. It's like, well, if the food's in the intestines, why do we have to start sending, why do we need more gastric secretions? Now, there are 3 phases of gastric secretions. The one we kind of already talked about is the cephalic reflex phase. It's the fact that if you smell food, taste food, see food, even thinking about food is enough. And as you're like, oh, as you're talking about food, I'm thinking about it. That in itself is enough to stimulate gastric secretion. The gastric phase lasts longer. The gastric phase lasts, sometimes it depends on what you ate and how much you ate, lasts around 3 to 4 hours. And this is where the majority of the gastric secretions are going to be produced. Your stomach starts making lots and lots of stomach secretions when it starts getting stretched out. Distension is the stretching of the stomach. And it stretches because you just ate something. And so that stretching of the stomach stimulates your stomach to make gastric secretions. Peptides, which is the partial breakdown of proteins. So again, you ate something, you've got food in there, it stimulates your stomach to start making juices. Low acidity, and I'm like, mostly it's because some of the breakdown of the food can produce acids. And that gastrin hormone is going to increase your gastric secretions. Now, your enteroendocrine cells, again, they're hormone-producing cells. Even though they're in the stomach, we call them entero. And I'm like, they're the ones that make gastrin, which, yes, stimulates gastric secretions, but things that can stimulate your enteroendocrine cells, caffeine, and I'm like, will stimulate your stomach to start making gastrin, to start making gastric juices. Peptides, partial breakdown of proteins, and if the pH is starting to rise, which sometimes can happen with some of the breakdown of foods. As your food is starting to get broken down, some of it can produce alkaline products. And so then it's like, well, we should probably make gastrin and then go back and start secreting additional juices to become acidic again. So I'm like, depending on what you eat, but pretty much if you eat anything that stretches out your stomach is going to start to make gastric juices to start breaking it down. The third phase of gastric secretions is the intestinal phase, and it has two parts. It has an stimulatory and an inhibitory effect. And I'm like, right away there is a stimulatory component. Partially digested food, when it leaves the stomach and goes in the intestine, there is a short time period. It's a brief, very brief time period where you have additional gastrin creating additional gastric juices. And I'm like, that doesn't last long. Most of the intestinal phase will lead to inhibitory effects. The fact that once food leaves the stomach to go to the intestine sends information to inhibit gastric secretions. Now, the inhibitory effect is known as the enterogastric reflex. Now, it's got two parts. What does the entero mean? And what does the gastro mean? Stomach. So this is the reflex when food goes, from the stomach to the intestines. So they just smush the two words together. And I'm like, same thing. Hormones, your gastrin. And I'm like, are the enterogastrones? And I'm like, help regulate this as well. Pretty much anytime you have chyme, that's now the mostly digested food. And I'm like, with lots of hydrochloric acid in it. And I'm like, if you've got fats, if you have partially broken down proteins, if you have any type of irritating substances, once those things hit the intestine, they're going to tell the stomach that we need to stop making gastric juices. Food is going into the intestine. It is the intestine's job to start breaking it down. Now, there are three reflexes that act all together, and I'm like, to inhibit gastric secretions, and I've got a little video. We'll see if my audio works. They're going to activate your sympathetic fibers when you're under stress. And when you're under stress, you want to inhibit everything. You're going to tighten your pyloric sphincter so that no more food is going to go into the intestine. So this is your stomach. This is the pylorus region. And there is a pyloric sphincter right there. It's up there. Might spell it wrong. And I'm like, there's a pyloric sphincter there before it goes into the duodenum. And we're going to tighten that so that we don't have any more food going from the stomach into the small intestine. We're going to try to decrease our gastric activity, mostly to protect our small intestine from the acid. Our stomach is adapted to having that low pH. Your intestine is not quite so adapted to having that low pH. Mm-hmm.
So would you say the pylorus sphincter is the guard that allows the food to leave the stomach?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so I'm like, as soon as food starts going into the intestine, it only goes in there small amounts at a time because your food is very acidic when it leaves the stomach. So as soon as that food goes into that intestine and you have that, rise in hydrochloric or hydrogen ions, which means you're going low pH, the information from your small intestine tells your stomach, we need to shut down gastric secretions. We have too much acid coming our way. Now, it's also at this point that you have hormones. They're enterogastrones. These are hormones, and I'm like, that are regulating pretty much what's going from the stomach into the intestines. That's why we smush the two words together. And there are 2 hormones that are released that are going to work with shutting down gastric secretions when food goes to the intestine. One is called secretin, one is called cholecystokinin. I usually just put a CCK on any other PowerPoints you see, any of the slides coming up. But these 2 hormones, when you have anything acidic going into the intestine, you're going to have that CCK and you're going to have secretin telling your stomach, we need to shut down your gastric secretions. Because if you have too much acidic food dumping into your intestine with all of that acid, it's known as the dumping syndrome, and it's when you start to feel nauseous. And I'm like, it triggers vomiting. So if you get done eating something and you're like, man, I just don't feel great or whatever, even if you ate a huge meal and like half an hour later you're like, I feel so nauseous, I ate so much. It happens. If you have a really full stomach, sometimes that really full stomach forces too much food into your intestine. Your intestine can't handle it. Your intestine cannot handle that low pH of too much food coming into it too fast. It will trigger nausea and vomiting. So get rid of that food because your intestine can't handle that low pH. Now, that is also something that happens for people that have gastric reduction. And I'm like, where they remove parts of the stomach. And it happens when they have a smaller stomach, that food goes through the stomach too quickly and into the intestines, and they feel nauseous a whole lot more. Now we're going to see if my audio works. Only because I'm like, I found this little animation it's from your book. That goes over the 3 reflexes. If the internet wants to work. There we go. Fix this.
Tactile sensation of food in the mouth. Regulation of
There we go.
stomach secretion is divided into 3 phases: cephalic, gastric, and intestinal. In the cephalic phase, the taste or smell of food, tactile sensation of food in the mouth, or thought of food, sends nervous impulses to the medulla oblongata. These impulses cause parasympathetic neurons via the vagus nerves to stimulate secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsin in the stomach. The parasympathetic stimulation also results in secretion of gastrin from the lower part of the stomach. This hormone travels through the bloodstream and further stimulates hydrochloric acid and pepsin secretion in the upper and middle parts of the stomach. In the gastric phase of gastric secretion, food has entered and distended the stomach. This distension activates a parasympathetic reflex via the medulla oblongata and also has a direct stimulatory effect on the gastric glands. The result is continued secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsin. In the intestinal phase of gastric secretion, chyme has entered the duodenum, so gastric secretion is no longer needed. When the chyme contains lipids from the digestion of fats or contains enough hydrochloric acid to bring its pH below 2, gastric secretion is inhibited. The lipids and hydrogen ions inhibit gastric secretion by 3 simultaneous actions. First, they cause impulses to go to the medulla oblongata to decrease parasympathetic stimulation of the gastric glands. Secondly, they set up local reflexes via neurons in the wall of the gut that decrease gastric secretion. Thirdly, they cause the release of 3 local hormones which travel via the circulation to the gastric glands and inhibit their secretion.
I talk about the 2 main ones. I don't care if it's the third one. But your secretin and CCK will go back and tell the stomach to stop making the gastric secretions. Okay, still have audio. Now, in your book, 23.19 if you want to look at it. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's lots of things that stimulate the stomach to make gastric secretions. You know, just seeing and hearing food, the fact that when there's food in the stomach and stretching it causes gastric secretions. And then when it gets to the intestinal phase, there's a very brief period when there's a rising gastric secretion, but mostly the intestinal phase is inhibitory. So there's lots of things that can tell the stomach to make acid or gastric secretions. And I'm like, but there's also lots of things that can inhibit the stomach from making those gastric secretions. Mostly it's all triggered by when food gets to the intestine. We don't need the gastric secretions anymore. Now, we have to make hydrochloric acid. It just doesn't naturally form. I'm trying to see if I can take my stomach and modify it. Here's a blood vessel. How do we make hydrochloric acid? How do we make that acid so that we have a low pH in the stomach? Well, the big thing is the parietal cells, which are known for making the hydrochloric acid, the parietal cells are going to pump hydrogen ions into the stomach. That's their job. But when you're pumping something with a positive ion in, we try to balance it out. And potassium ions are going to leave so that we still balance out our ions. We do have the bicarbonate ions that are going to get pumped out of the stomach. There are cells, I don't know how to draw it. There are cells found along the stomach that are known as anti-porter cells, which just means they transport two things in opposite directions. Anti meaning opposite. Their job is to transport bicarbonate ions out of the stomach that are going to end up in your blood vessels. And because you have something negative leaving, we have to make it equal with charge. We're going to pump something negative in, and what we're going to pump in are your negatively charged chloride ions. So all we've done is we've pumped hydrogen ions in, and we pumped chloride ions in, and when you mix hydrogen and chloride together, you get hydrogen chloride. That's your acid. That is that strong acid that makes your stomach have that really low pH. Now, because we are sending out this bicarbonate ion, which is an alkaline, it's a base structure, the blood that leaves the stomach areas, because they have additional bicarbonate ion, and I'm like, is more alkaline. That blood is more alkaline, just because they're accepting more of that bicarbonate ion. Now, some responses from your stomach to filling, you know, after you eat your big Christmas dinner, or who knows what you're going to eat on Thursday for the 4th, your stomach can stretch to accommodate most of what you eat. And I'm like, you can eat about 1.5 liters worth of food without really even noticing it. Your stomach just stretches. Now, 1.5 liters, I don't have a 2-liter bottle, but this is 0.5 liters. So you could eat about 3 of these worth of food before your stomach really starts to stretch enough when you start to feel full. Now, that can change between different people as well, their exact amount, but the pressure in your stomach remains constant until you hit about 1.5 liters of food. And I'm like, your stomach can still stretch beyond that. And you're like, oh, I eat way more than 3 of these on Christmas Day. You can actually put about 6 liters of food into your stomach. It's a lot of food. And I'm like, now, that's going to be very painful. And I'm like, it's going to stretch a whole lot. And I'm like, but your stomach can stretch. It's known as gastric accommodation. And I'm like, it's made of smooth muscle, and it can stretch. And I'm like, people that do those eating competitions, they make their stomach stretch larger than the average person. And I'm like, and even though it will constrict back after a while, if you're a person that, you know, eats large amounts of things for competitions, and I'm like, you are always eating large quantities of food all at once to try to stretch that stomach out and stay stretched out. Now, your stomach, when it does have food in it, as it's churning food around, it is trying to get rid of the food. It wants to get food from the stomach into the small intestine, and as it constricts down on the food, it's moving food out. It's called peristalsis. It is squeezing food from top down. And I'm like, I know my next slide has a picture of it. So it starts squeezing that food from the top, and it's working its way down to the bottom pyloric region of the stomach. However, not all of the food goes out. Your stomach is squeezing about 3 times a minute trying to get food out of that stomach. Only about 3, I don't have it on the slide, only about 3 milliliters of food actually leaves your stomach with each squirt or with each contraction. So 3 times a minute, your stomach is squeezing food and trying to get it out. But when it's squeezing it, it's mixing it, it's digesting it, but only about 3 milliliters actually goes from the stomach into the intestine. Again, we don't want all of the food dumping into the intestine. That's too much acid too fast. So we squeeze it, only 3 milliliters goes in. Whatever hasn't gone in goes backward for more churning around and waiting for the next peristaltic contraction. So I'm like, it's constantly 3 times a minute. If you just got done eating, this is happening in your stomach right now. 3 times a minute it is squeezing top down so that about 3 milliliters goes into the duodenum. The rest of it goes backward in something known as retropulsion. Retro means backwards. The rest of it goes backwards for more churning around, waiting for another peristaltic contraction. So it allows our stomach to churn food all around, squeeze it, and then deliver small amounts of food into your intestine at a time. Yes, usually not as much and usually not as hard. Only because you still have some gastric juices in there, which right away your body's going to be trying to push some of them in there. Usually not as much. But it's why your stomach will growl. It's because you have air mixed in there too, and you have air moving around inside there. Now, as that chyme, because we don't like to call it food anymore, as that chyme enters the intestine, again, you have receptors that are going to stretch because it's accepting food. You're going to have chemical signals realizing we're accepting. We've got proteins, we've got acid, we've got lipids, we've got carbohydrates, we've got lots of different types of chemicals that are all going in there. And with its reflex, it will send information back to the stomach to decrease your gastric secretions. Now, carbohydrate-rich food moves through your intestine, specifically that first part of the intestine, faster than any other kind of food. It's the main reason I'm like, if you ate, this is my kids all the time, they want toast for breakfast, and then 45 minutes later, I'm hungry. Of course you are, because there is no food in there that's going to stay in your stomach. It is just flying through their stomach, it's flying through your intestine. Carbohydrate-rich food moves through very quickly. Proteins and lipids take longer, and I'm like, to move through your stomach and into the intestine. And so fatty chyme remains in your stomach and in your duodenum for 6 hours or more, which is why if you eat food that has any kind of fat in it and even proteins, and I'm like, it will stay in there longer. You will feel full longer. And I'm like, it doesn't move quickly through it. Some of it. And I'm like, you can still, if you eat a really, really big dinner, because then there's another thing, if you eat a massive dinner, your Christmas dinner, and you're like, oh, I'm going to be so full, I'm never eating all day, and then it's like 3 hours later, I'm hungry again. Sometimes when you stretch your stomach so much, your body's reaction is, we need to get rid of food super, super fast. And really full stomachs could empty actually faster than not super full stomachs. So yes and no, to some point, yes. If you ate, if my kids ate like 7 pieces of toast, they would be really full. They might not be hungry 45 minutes later, but it still would be, they'd be hungrier sooner if they ate something that had some protein and some type of fat in it. Now, if at some point, I'm like, we've got things that can happen, and I'm like, if you've got the dumping syndrome, I'm like, that you had too much going into the intestine at once, and it can trigger vomiting. And I'm like, the official medical word for vomiting is emesis. It can be caused by extreme stretching of your stomach, extreme stretching of the duodenum. It could be by some other type of intestinal irritants, meaning something's just making your intestines not happy. And if your intestines aren't happy, their main job is to get rid of that thing that's not making them happy as quickly as possible, whether that's vomiting or diarrhea. They don't care. And I'm like, but if it leads to vomiting, I mean, you've got various bacterial toxins. And I'm like, that's going to cause your food poisoning and vomiting. Excessive alcohol, spicy foods, certain drugs are all going to trigger emesis or vomiting. Vomiting itself is controlled by your medulla. And kind of things that are going to happen, like with vomiting. One, usually you go pale. So usually the first symptom that you see someone that looks nauseous, they look very pale. Two, they will start to salivate if you never realized it. Usually one of the things, if you're like, oh yeah, the last time I was throwing up, I was like spitting and I was just salivating. That is your body's way of trying to protect your teeth. And I'm like, because vomit is very acidic, and acid is going to wear away at the enamel on your teeth. That excessive saliva is there to coat your teeth to try to protect it from that really strong acid. You're also going to have your nasopharynx, and I'm like, well, not your nasopharynx, but you're going to have your soft palate kind of go upwards to try to block your nasopharynx while you're vomiting. What is that to prevent? Yeah, so food doesn't go out your nose. Does it always work? No. And I'm like, but it tries. It tries. And I'm like, but you're also going to have, I was going to say, usually the vomiting itself is your diaphragm is going to push down on your stomach. Your stomach's sitting like right here, and your diaphragm's right above it. And I'm like, your diaphragm is going to be pushing on your intestine and on your stomach. It's mostly your duodenum part of the intestine. And all the food that's in your stomach and in the duodenum, most people think you're only throwing up stuff from your stomach and from the duodenum. And I'm like, all of that is going to get forced out. So it's that pressure from the diaphragm pushing down in your stomach is the force that's going to push the food up and out. Now, people that have excessive vomiting, you are losing a lot of fluids. It could lead to dehydration. It could also lead to electrolyte and acid-base balances. You are throwing up a lot of acid. You're getting rid of a lot of hydrogen ions out of your body when you're excessively vomiting. And like that can cause a condition known as alkalosis, that your body starts to become alkaline when you're vomiting up all that additional hydrogen ion. That's excessive vomiting. Now, moving our way down. And I'm like, going from the stomach into the small intestine, there are 3 parts to the small intestine, and we colorize them, dark purple, blue, and a pinkish color. First one is the duodenum, and although it is the shortest of the 3 sections, the most stuff happens there. So I'm like, it's the most interesting, and I'm like, the jejunum and the ileum we don't even really talk about, because the majority of stuff happens in that first section, in the duodenum. And part of it, if you notice, the duodenum is because you have secretions coming from the gallbladder, you have secretions coming from the liver, and you have secretions from the pancreas, which is hiding kind of back here. They're all going to dump into the duodenum. And so I'm like, lots of stuff happens in the duodenum. Jejunum and ileum, not so much. Now, before it becomes the duodenum, we have a valve between the stomach and the intestine. That's your pyloric sphincter that allows only 3 milliliters of chyme to go in at a time. We also have a valve, or a sphincter, at the end of our ileum, and it's right before it goes into the very first part of your large intestine, the cecum. So it's called your ileocecal valve, because it's at the end of the ileum, and the first part of the large intestine is called the cecum. And so we just smush the 2 words together, and there's a valve there as well. Lab you will. Now, the duodenum, again, shortest part, maybe about 10 inches, is the most interesting part, but it kind of curves around the pancreas. So again, you have various secretions coming from the liver and gallbladder, you have secretions from the pancreas. They are all dumping into the duodenum. And so, and I'm like, they join all together. All the secretions from the gallbladder and liver, plus the pancreas, all join together, and all the secretions dump in one hole. Now, lab, you got to know each of the little major biles, bile ducts and pancreatic ducts. And I'm like, but they all join in. They all dump into the duodenum. The jejunum, they get my 1 slide here. And I'm like, in the ileum. They're not so long. They're not so important. I mean, they're important, but they're not as interesting. The jejunum, it's about 8 feet long. Although it's the small intestine. It's only called small because it's smaller in width. And I'm like, but it's way longer than the large intestine. And I'm like, so the jejunum section's about 8 feet. And then the ileum, which ends at the large intestine, is about 12 feet. So I'm like, you have a lot of small intestine in there. It's only called small because it's narrow. Now, inside the small intestine, we have lots of absorption taking place. Lots of absorption in the small intestine. The job of the small intestine is to absorb your food. The large intestine, not so much. Large intestine is to absorb water, to compact it into feces. Small intestine, absorb food. And because we have so much absorption that has to take place, all the nutrients are going to get broken down in the small intestine and absorbed in the small intestine. There's some things that help increase surface area. And I'm like, so you can maximize that absorption. One, there are circular folds. The inside of your small intestine has folds in it. So if we looked inside your small intestine, it looks ribbed. And I'm like, there's a whole bunch of folds inside of there. Those are permanent folds that stay there. We also have villi. So when I zoom in on those circular folds, so there's your big, huge folds. When I zoom in, they also have these big finger-like projections called villi all over. But then we're going to zoom in even more into those villi. And then on the villi, we zoom in on the villi. We have cells that line the villi. And then the cells that line the villi also have folds, so we call them microvilli. So there's microvilli on the cells that line the villi. All of it is to increase surface area. And I'm like, we have to absorb everything you eat. Like 99% of it. 99% of everything you eat is absorbed in the small intestine. So lots of interesting stuff happens in the duodenum, but the small intestine is there for absorbing all your food. So we've got all of these things that are just there to, and I'm like, so we can absorb foods, lots and lots of surface area. Now, your microvilli, the cells that also have those additional folds up there, there are enzymes that are also secreted there. We'll talk more about the enzymes next class. And I'm like, well, we call them brush border enzymes, but they make lots of enzymes for breaking down more carbohydrates and more proteins. So there's enzymes in the stomach for breaking down carbohydrates and proteins and lipids. There's enzymes even found in the saliva for breaking various things down, but the enzymes found in your small intestine are there to make sure everything gets broken down. Now, in your intestine, you do have little intestinal crypts. So you've got these big, huge finger-like projections called villi, but you also have these big, huge indents. They call them crypts. You know, they're down below the surface. And it's your intestinal crypts, and I'm like, they're making more secretions. And my note is that the epithelium in your intestine is also replaced about every 2 to 4 days. So your stomach cells, 3 to 6 days. Your intestines replaced every 2 to 4 days. And I'm like, and it's the cells that are found in those little crypts there that are secreting more intestinal juices. And your intestinal juices are different than your gastric juices. And so we have enteroendocrine cells found there. These are cells that make hormones that are found in the intestines. And I'm like, we also have lymphocytes. They're intraepithelial lymphocytes. These are cells that are patrolling for any type of bacteria or anything foreign, viruses, anything foreign that you may have eaten that didn't die in the stomach. And we have cells found in here called Panna cells that secrete antimicrobial agents. Because yes, although your stomach kills a lot of the bacteria you eat, some will make it past the stomach and get into the intestine, and we are trying to still kill them there. And so we've got some cells and we have some chemicals that are there to still try to kill anything you may have eaten. Now, little, factoid with our epithelial cells. Chemotherapy, the chemicals that are used when you are targeting cancer cells. Cancer cells are rapidly dividing cells. They're dividing uncontrolled. They divide very, very quickly, and we have chemicals that can specifically target rapidly reproducing cells, cancer cells. However, some of the chemicals are not specific. They're going to target any rapidly producing or rapidly reproducing cells. Well, the cells in your digestive tract, in your stomach, in your small intestine, they're getting replaced every few days. That's another place where we have rapidly reproducing cells, which means the chemicals used in chemotherapy can target and kill the cells in your stomach and your intestine. And again, anything that irritates your stomach or your intestine is generally going to give you nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. It's one of the main reasons why people that undergo chemotherapy are nauseous, they're vomiting, and they have diarrhea. It's because those chemicals are killing rapidly reproducing cells, like cancer cells, but because the cells in your intestinal tract also rapidly reproduce so fast as well, it will target them as well. Now, in the mucosa region of your small intestine, we have what are known as little Peyer's patches. They're kind of these dark purplish blobs that are up here. Again, they're there to also try to find foreign invaders. So you've got chemicals that are there to try to inhibit bacteria from growing or to kill bacteria, but also found in your intestinal tract, in the mucosal lining, and we have little lymphatic nodules. They're not lymph glands like you find other lymph nodes and glands elsewhere in the body. They're just these little tiny, nodules. We have a whole bunch of them in our intestines, in our small and our large intestines. And we find a lot of our lymphocytes there trying to find any foreign invaders. If you have a lot of bacteria in your intestine, whether it's small intestine or large intestine, there's a lot of bacteria in your large intestine. And I'm like, if there's a lot of bacteria in here, there's a good chance those bacteria are going to want to try to leave there and make their way past the intestinal tract. And so we have additional little areas, they call them Peyer's patches, but these little lymphatic nodules with lots of lymphocytes that are constantly patrolling for foreign invaders that are trying to get through, because they are. And I'm like, whether it's parasitic worms, whether it's bacteria, whether it's viruses, anything that you eat, anything that can get in the body wants to get past the wall of the intestine. And we've got extra cells that are there that are trying to prevent that. You also have in the mucosal lining, and I'm like, in your duodenal glands, because it's part of the duodenum, and I'm like, that are secreting additional secretions that are there to try to neutralize the acid that's coming towards them. So it's only found in the duodenum region. Again, you have lots of acidic chyme coming toward them. Your small intestine's trying to neutralize that acid that's coming. Now, you made, quite a bit of stomach juice, and like 3 liters of stomach juice, or no, was it 1.5? 1.5 juice? Lots of gastric juices. Your intestine makes more juices. Your intestine makes about 1 to 2 liters of intestinal juices every single day. So you've got lots of gastric juices breaking stuff down. You have lots of intestinal juices breaking stuff down. Your intestinal juices are slightly alkaline. Part of it is, to neutralize a little bit of the acid. And I say slightly alkaline, around 7.4. And I'm like, it's pretty close in alkalinity is your blood pH. It's mostly water-based. It doesn't have a lot of enzymes. Those are made elsewhere. And I'm like, it just usually contains a lot of mucus. Mostly it's to facilitate the moving of food through the intestine, so the transport of food, and allows that food, when I'm like, to get broken down in the water to hopefully get absorbed in your small intestine. So make lots of juices. Now, the liver and the gallbladder are considered accessory glands, meaning they are not part of the digestive tract. Food does not go through them. So food is not going through this whatsoever, but they are still helping in the breakdown of food. Your liver does have a lot of functions. A lot of it has to do with cleaning out blood and filtering blood, but its digestive function, which we care about in this chapter, is that it makes bile. Now, why we care about bile? Bile is known as a fat emulsifier. Now, when we talk about emulsification, means I can take a big fat glob, and emulsification just means fat doesn't like to stick to fat. And so it breaks fat down into smaller globs. That's it. It's not actually chemically breaking down the fat, but it is making fat into smaller fat molecules. Still all fat, it's still all lipid, it's still the same chemical itself, it's just in smaller form. It's called fat emulsification. Now, your liver makes bile, your gallbladder stores it. Can you live without your gallbladder? Yeah, has anyone had their gallbladder removed? Do you guys know people that have had their gallbladder removed? I was like, it's not that uncommon. And I'm like, now your liver, biggest organ. It's like massive. You'll see it on the cadaver. And I'm like, huge, massive organ. It's divided into 4 lobes. You have a right lobe, this big, massive one, a left one, big, huge, massive one, and 2 smaller ones. We have is the caudate and the quadrate, like this little lobe and that little lobe. It's massive, massive. Now, there are various ducts in here, and yes, in lab you have to know them. And I'm like, you have a duct coming from the gallbladder. You have ducts coming just from the liver itself. Where the 2 join together, you have the common bile duct, and it will eventually meet up where the pancreas secretes as well and dump into the duodenum.
So if you don't have a gallbladder, where does that duct go?
It would cut off. And so I'm like, they would cut off your cystic duct here as well, but you still have bile getting produced and still going in to help with digestion. So I'm like, usually right away your body has to adjust a little bit because the bile's job is fat emulsification, which means right after a gallbladder is removed, if you eat really fatty food, you're not going to break it down very well, and it will literally go right through you. I know I'm running out of time. I want to see where I wanted to get. We'll leave there. We'll start talking liver Tuesday. How many